Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Applicant webinar. My name is Jessica Holmes, and I am the Chief Deputy Executive Director at the State Board of Education. Welcome. Today we will have several speakers, including myself. In addition, we'll have Nancy Brynelson and Bonnie Garcia, who are our statewide literacy co-directors from the Department of Education. We will also have Matt Brunetti, who's a Senior Program Associate with West Ed. All of the folks who you are going to be hearing speaking today are involved in the work of the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Selection Panel. If you would please, we have a Q&A section. If you can see the Q&A option on your screen. We don't have chat enabled, but we do have a Q&A enabled. If you could please, in the Q&A, write your name and affiliation or organization, we can collect some of that information and make sure that we are keeping note of who is attending the webinar. In addition, we will also talk a little bit about how you can submit questions if you have questions after this webinar, but one really important thing to keep in mind, whether you have questions or not, is to please sign up for our mailing list, because it's a really great way to get information about this process. And we'll have some information in just a moment about how you can do that. In terms of technical logistics, so we won't have a traditional Q&A section in this webinar, but you will be able to submit any questions you might have into the Q&A section. Click on that button and you can submit your questions throughout this webinar. It's very likely that there will be several questions or many questions that we won't be able to answer here today. However, we will be posting an FAQ with answers to questions that we didn't get to during the webinar later on in July. And so if we don't get to your question here today, please keep a lookout for that. As we move into July, please keep a lookout for our FAQs that we'll be posting. So again, please submit any questions you might have into the Q&A along with your name and affiliation or organization. But know that that's very possible we won't get to your question today, and if we don't, we will be posting FAQs later this month. So in addition to the Q&A, we will be posting some links to some of the documents that we are going to be discussing in our presentation today. So we'll make sure and get those posted here just shortly. Any other, most of the links that we'll be sharing today will also be available in the invitation to submit document that you will see on the RDRSSP website. So also recommend you looking at that as well. So as we're getting started, just want to review the purpose of our webinar today. We are looking to provide you all with information about how to submit a screening instrument on behalf of your organization to the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Selection Panel, pursuant to Education Code Section 53008. If you have not had a chance to read through Education Code Section 53008, I highly recommend it. We'll be reviewing some components of it today in this meeting, but it is really important. We're not going to cover everything, and there's a lot of details and nuances in that language that you should be familiar with. So I highly recommend looking it up and reading through the full text of that code section. So our agenda for today, we will be talking about the schedule of significant events. Again, that is also in the invitation to submit document. We'll also be doing an overview of the statute, the evaluation criteria, and the priorities of the panel. We'll be doing a walkthrough of the evaluation rubric, as well as the submission form and its alignment with the rubric. We'll also talk about other submission information, including the cover sheet. And it's important to note that there are 3 components to the submission process. There's the invitation to submit document, and then the actual application materials themselves are the submission form and the cover sheet. So we'll be talking about all of those. If we are able to answer any questions that come through the Q&A today, we will do so. and then we'll wrap it up. And for those of you who have just joined, I've seen several people just joined a little bit late. Just a reminder, please, in the Q&A to list your name and your affiliation. And then if you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A. We will try to track them throughout the webinar. As I noted earlier, if we can answer them, we will. If not, please keep a lookout for the FAQs that will be coming later this month. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Bonnie Garcia, one of our state co-literacy directors from the Department of Education. Bonnie?
Thanks, Jess. I am going to go over the proposed schedule of events, which the panel does have the right to amend at any time. On June 12th, the invitation to submit package was released. And today, July 2nd, we're holding the informational webinar. On July 26th and on August 23rd, the panel will meet, and more to come around these summer meetings. On August 9th will be the deadline to submit any application questions, and information about this specifically you can find on the invitation to submit package on page 8. On August 30th, all submissions of screening instruments must be received by 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and more information on this to come. On September 20th, October 18th, and November 18th, the panel will meet again and deliberate. I will talk a little bit more about the November 18th meeting in just a second. And the panel will meet again on December 16th. For this next slide, there we go. I just want to emphasize that the panel does reserve the right to amend the proposed schedule of events at any time. And for that November 18th panel meeting, it is anticipated that at this time, the panel will share its recommendations for approved screening instruments, and further anticipated that the applicants will have the ability to provide public comment to the panel before the panelists vote on the final adoption of the approved list of screening instruments. However, as you see here on the screen, depending on the number of applications and the time it will take the panel to review and evaluate them, the proposed timeline is subject to change. So now I have the pleasure of turning it back to Jessica, who will provide an overview on additional information.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the statute, which really is the language that guides all of the work of the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Selection Panel. I'll talk a little bit about how the statute informs the evaluation criteria, and then I'll also provide more context for this work by reviewing the priorities of the panel. So as I mentioned, Education Code Section 53008 is the guiding language for all of the work of the panel. And what this establishes is a requirement for local educational agencies. It requires all local educational agencies that serve kindergarten, first and second grade students to screen them for risk of reading difficulties beginning in the 2025-26 school year. In order to determine which screening instruments meet the requirements of this mandate, the statute also establishes the Reading Difficulties Risk Screener Selection Panel, also known as the RDRSSP, as a panel of experts that are required to select the appropriate instruments for screening by December 31st, 2024. The statute also discusses the purpose of screening. And this is really important. It talks about how screening is supposed to be part of a school's comprehensive instructional strategy, and that results should be used by educators like other types of formative and summative assessments. So really, to be used in the classroom as part of the work that teachers do to help students move forward academically. They also talk about the importance of screening as part of early identification and intervention, with evidence-based early literacy instructional strategies that are intended to improve literacy outcomes for pupils at risk of and with reading difficulties, including dyslexia. So it's very important to note that this is the screening instruments themselves and the mandate are not supposed to be diagnostic in nature, but are intended to be part of the overall instructional strategy and are intended to help teachers adopt strategies or administrators to adopt strategies to meet students where they are, identify their unique needs to help them learn and achieve the most that they can academically. The statute also requires that the screeners be evidence-based and culturally, linguistically, and developmentally appropriate. This has been a really important concept for our panel members in discussing what we should be looking for or what they should be looking for in evaluating screening instruments. They should also, again, assess pupils for risk of reading difficulties. It also defines what reading difficulties means. That's in the statutory definitions. And then another component of the statute also defines screening instruments as being brief tools administered by appropriately trained employees, measuring discrete areas to determine a pupil's risk of reading difficulties. One of the most important components of the statute for the purposes of the RDRSSP is Education Code Section 53008G1. And this is because this section outlines the statutory criteria that the panel has to measure any screening instrument against, or all screening instruments against. So these, again, highly recommend you read through Education Code Section 53008 and pay particular attention to these. You will notice that these are the criteria upon which the review process, the evaluation criteria, the rubric, and the submission form are all built. So there's a focus on the use of direct measurement supplemented by other pupil data, measurement of domains that may predict dyslexia and other reading disorders, evidence that the tool or the instrument is normed and validated using contemporary multicultural and multilanguage samples of pupils, with outcome data for pupils whose home language is a language other than English, as well as English speakers. Also, there needs to be integration of relevant pupil demographic information, such as home language, English language fluency, etc. Screening instruments should include guidance and resources for educators regarding both how to administer and interpret the screening instruments and their results. There's also a note that guidance must be informed by the ELA, ELD, or English Language Arts, English Language Development Framework for California Public Schools that was adopted by the State Board of Education, the California Dyslexia Guidelines, the knowledge of effective interventions, and guidance must also reflect a tiered interventions model aligned with MTSS. The statute also provides additional parameters beyond just the criteria outlined in G1. It specifies that screening instruments, again, are not to be used as an evaluative or diagnostic tool to establish eligibility for special education. However, it goes further to say that they may be used by an LEA to recommend that a pupil receive further assessment or evaluation to establish eligibility for special education. And the statute also says that results from screening may not be used for any high stakes purposes such as grading or grade placement. There's also significant language around screening English language learners, and this is also another area of the statute that is of specific interest and importance to our panel members. So the panel is required to select screening instruments both in English language and in as many languages as they can, reflecting those that are spoken by students throughout the state, to the extent that those assessments are available. So the panel is going to be looking to adopt screening instruments in multiple languages. And that may mean that the list that they adopt reflects screeners from different publishers, and maybe they'll select certain languages from one publisher, but not other languages. It really depends. But they are required by the statute to identify screening instruments in as many languages as they can, to the extent that those are in alignment with the criteria that's established in law. The statute also provides an alternative protocol to assess a student for potential risk of reading difficulty if a screening instrument is not available in at least one language in which the student is proficient. And so again, more of that information on what that alternative protocol is can be found in Education Code Section 53008. So the statute goes on again, talking about results from screening, and repeats similar language that I flagged before, that results from screening are intended to be used as part of a broader process that leads to further evaluation of the student's needs and progress, identifies supports for that student for instruction, and enables targeted individual intervention and further assessments if needed or if concerns don't resolve. And then there's an additional statute, and I don't go into much detail here, but there's more detail in the statute that talks about what steps need to be taken by an LEA after a student has been identified as being at risk of having a reading difficulty pursuant to being, or after being screened. Finally, Education Code Section 53008C2 charges the panel with providing information on the appropriate administration of each screening instrument. And that includes, but is not limited to, the appropriate grades for each screening instrument. The panel has not discussed what this information, in whatever form it will look. They haven't discussed yet what it will include. So we know for sure that because it's called out, appropriate grade level will be identified. But there could be other information that the panel decides that it wants to provide to LEAs about the screening instruments that it has chosen. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the cover sheet, but that is a conversation that we anticipate that the panel will engage in throughout the summer and fall about the types of information they want to provide. So that was a very brief high-level overview of 53008. But all of that was important to understand the next steps that the panel and the state board took to take that language and that statute to turn it into something that the panel could use to identify screeners as being approved for purposes of meeting the mandates for screening that will go into effect in 25-26. So the statute requires that the RDRSSP advises the state board on a review process for determining which screening instruments will be approved to meet the requirements of the statute, and requires the state board to adopt a review process with evaluation criteria for the panel to use. So throughout the spring, the panel and the board have been engaged in this work. The RDRSSP used the statute to develop recommended processes and evaluation criteria to inform their process to the state board, and the state board adopted the components of this process. So the review process, review elements and evaluation criteria, and rubric at its May 2024 meeting. So if you would like to learn more about that process, you can look at the RDRSSP agendas going back throughout the spring, and then also the May board meeting agenda has more information about the review process, review elements and evaluation criteria, and the rubric for your perusal. So the first step in trying to take what was in the statute and turn it into something that could be practically used by the panel to identify a list of screeners, approved screeners, was the development of review elements. And really what these review elements are is they're a very high level overview of what the panel is going to be looking for. And they provide a little bit more of a narrative version of that. So highly recommend looking at them. They were developed based on the criteria identified in 53008G. The review elements serve as a basis for the evaluation criteria. And they were adopted by the State Board of Education on May 8th, 2024. They are comprised of 3 major areas of focus, and you'll see this reflected in the rubric and the submission form: the description of assessment battery, psychometrics, and communication and resources. From the review elements, the evaluation criteria were developed. The criteria require the panel to consider all of the following. So the first is the extent to which the screening instruments measure key constructs in a manner that is theoretically and empirically well-grounded and evaluated for each grade level and language. The extent to which the mode of administration for the screening instruments are appropriate for the students being evaluated. And again, this should be reflective of student needs and developmental levels. The extent to which the screening instruments offer well-grounded guidance for determining when a student has sufficient language proficiency for them to be used appropriately. So again, you know, how are we ensuring that a student has enough language proficiency to be able to take a screening instrument and have its results be valid? The extent to which the screening instruments have been shown to be reliable and valid for populations of students that represent the California student population. The extent to which the screening instruments offer useful guidance, resources, and professional development for the administration, interpretation of data, and reporting of results for populations that represent the student demographics of California. The extent to which screening instruments offer educators and families useful guidance for next steps. And the extent to which the screening instruments align with California guidance and the ELA-ELD framework and the California dyslexia guidelines. So you should be seeing in each one of these criteria, and there's 7 of them in total, you should be seeing echoes of what was in the statute, because that is really what it's based on. So these evaluation criteria were then used to create a rubric, which I will turn over to Matt here in just a second to discuss. But before I do that, I also wanted to provide you with a little bit of information about some of the priorities that the panel has discussed. So if you've been paying attention to the panel meetings, our panel members have talked a lot about the components or the characteristics of the screening instruments that they'll be evaluating that are of particular importance to them and are aligned with the statutory requirements. So one of the things that's come up in various ways throughout the process of discussing this with the panel, among the panel members, has been the importance that these screening instruments align with the needs and diversity of California students. So really, they're really looking for an appropriateness of the screening instruments for California's unique student population. There's a great concern that non-English versions of screening instruments should be developed from the ground up for the languages for which they're intended to measure risk of reading difficulty, and should not just be a direct translation of an English version. We also have several educators on our panel, and they're very interested and concerned about ease of administration of these screening instruments, and wanting to ensure that they are not administratively burdensome to administer and don't take significant time away from instruction. And just to provide you with a sense, for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with California student demographics, the following information is information about the student demographics that we've taken from the California School Dashboard website that provides information about the different kinds of student groups that we track in California, both by characteristic, by race and ethnicity, how many of those different students we have in the state, and the percentage of our students that meet each of those criteria and characteristics. So our panel is very aware of this information and keeping it in mind when they're making their decisions. And then the next slide shows the different languages that are spoken in California schools. This comes from the Basic Facts California Language Census Fall 2022 on the Department of Education's website, and shows you the different languages besides English that are spoken in California schools and the percentage of non-English speakers or English learners that speak each of those languages. It's important to note that English learner data are collected for 108 language groups. I don't think that the panel is under any incorrect assumptions about the number of that they'll get screening instruments submitted for all 108 languages, but they will be looking for as many languages as they can to make sure that students have access to this important screening. So I'm going to stop here and turn things over to Matt Bernetti from Wested. Matt?
Thank you, Jess, and hello, everyone. I'm going to walk through the structure of the evaluation rubric and the submission form. As you will see, a lot of this will build off the slides that Jess just presented to you all around the evaluation criteria and review elements. So next slide, sorry. So the rubric, the panel spent their time in their spring meetings to review and develop the rubric to align with the review elements and evaluation criteria. You'll see that this is also aligned to those 3 areas of focus in 3 sections: description of assessment battery, a psychometrics section, and a communication and resources section. Within each of those sections, you will see one of the evaluation criteria, lettered A through F within the rubric, aligned to each of those sections. And then furthermore, underneath each of the evaluation criteria, you will see 1 or more evidence statements. Each evidence statement is then articulated as what the panel would expect to see in terms of strong, moderate, and minimal evidence. The evaluation criteria and all these evidence statements that are aligned to them collectively offer a comprehensive assessment of the appropriateness of the instrument. So throughout the entire rubric, as you'll see from start to finish, it really considers the entire appropriateness of the instrument, which is why it's arranged in these 3 categories and so closely aligned to the review elements and evaluation criteria. The developmental appropriateness of the instrument is basically described throughout the description of assessment battery sections and the psychometric section. And then each distinguishing feature of each evidence level are going to be evaluated with particular attention to the quality of the evidence. Oops, slides are changing. Sorry, the quality of the evidence provided, as well as the thoroughness of the supporting documentation. And I'll get into more of that with the submission form, but that's a really key piece that the panel wanted to highlight, that they really are looking for quality of the evidence provided in regard to each of these rubric criteria, and also the evidence statements, and also as how well the supporting documentation supports that. This is a slide that kind of gives you a brief overview, almost like the table of contents of the rubric. So you can see in the first column there, it's the section or the review element for which those 3 pieces that are aligned again to the review elements that Jess described: description of assessment, psychometrics, and communication and resources. The second column lists the evidence statements and their numbering that you'll see throughout the rubric document and also in the submission form. So you can see that under aligned to description of assessment, they all begin with the number 1. Psychometrics will all begin with the number 2, and communication and resources with the number 3. And then the second letter, the A, B, C, D, or E, or F associated with those are aligned directly to the evaluation criteria. Again, that came from Jess's presentation and so on. And then the next Roman numeral of 1, 2, and 3 describe the evidence statements for which there is a strong, moderate, and minimal evidence description provided for each one. The page numbers are associated with those page numbers in the rubric, and those are listed at the far right column of the screen. So you can see there are 20 evidence statements that are going to be reviewed. This slide shows a snapshot of one piece of the rubric, but just to give you an example of the details for which they are. So the number 1, description of assessment battery, highlighted in bold, that's the section or the review element. The next level of the hierarchy, letter A, is the, oops. Sorry. Letter A is the evaluation criterion, for which there are A through F. The evidence statement that aligns to 1A, the first one anyway, is listed next. And then you can see each one has 3 descriptions of the different evidence levels: strong, moderate, and minimal. And again, the panel really focused a lot on trying to describe the difference in the quality of the evidence, and the discerning features between what they were looking for in terms of supporting evidence to support their ratings via this rubric. So we are encouraging you to also download the rubric. This rubric was reviewed and approved by the State Board of Education during its May 8th meeting on 2024. That is the link to the actual documentation that was provided publicly for the May board meeting. But you'll also notice that the rubric and the submission form are very much aligned with each other. The submission form is essentially the rubric broken down into multiple pieces. So I'll explain that more in a few slides. As the panel continues with its summer meetings, particularly its July and August meetings, they will continue to discuss the evaluation of applications using this rubric. So we encourage you to either follow along, attend or follow along on the live webinar, or follow up with the webinar recordings afterwards, as the panel continues to discuss the use of the rubric to evaluate the applications. Some potential topics they might discuss are the logistics of how and who on the panel will review each section and or each criterion, how the instruments will be evaluated against the criteria, including whether they will be treated as whether certain criteria will be treated as more consequential than others. And then finally, how final decisions on approval will be made via that. So again, those will be discussed throughout the July and August panel meetings. Moving on to the submission form and discussing its alignment with the rubric, as I mentioned, they are very closely aligned. The submission form is essentially each rubric evidence statement broken separately into its own page. So you'll see, and all the lettering and numbering is exactly the same as the rubric. So you'll see this is similar to the example I showed a few slides ago, where this is 1A1 under the description of assessment battery. And then you can see on each page, you'll have a response and evidence, and then a portion for you as an applicant to complete, and your description of how your instrument aligns to and meets the criteria, both within the evaluation criteria evidence statement and as along the strong, moderate, and minimal continuum. This submission form is also available on the RDRSSP website, for which I see the links being posted in the chat for all of you to review. Again, this submission form is designed intentionally so that applicants can demonstrate how the screening instrument that you're proposing addresses each of these evaluation criteria. As I mentioned, each evidence statement from the rubric is listed on the submission form, creating a cohesive alignment all the way between the SBE approved evaluation criteria, which ultimately stems from the statute, and the tool and this rubric for evaluating the submission materials. Throughout this submission form, we encourage applicants to describe and map how their screening instrument addresses each of these evidence statements. And when completing this form, you should definitely reference the rubric and the review elements and evaluation criteria further But really the submission form should include every piece of the rubric within it. So, but as a whole, reviewing all of those evaluation criteria is a very important step when completing the submission form. Really, the submission form was also created so that the panelists could review and the information and evidence provided by you all more clearly and not have to go searching through various sources of documentation to kind of discern where these things are. So really, we encourage the applicants to provide your strongest evidence first and really just well described, using clear and concise language throughout. As we acknowledge and the panel acknowledges that sometimes in your descriptions, it's necessary to point to other documentation that can't easily be summarized or included in that. And if that is necessary to do, then we encourage, and the panel encourages you to include that additional information and clearly reference it appropriately so that it's easy for the panelists to find. Any supporting evidentiary materials should be clearly labeled and with that numbering system from the submission form. So you could say this supporting material aligns to 1.A.1, for example, and is included as an attachment to the submission form. And you'll see on the very last page of the submission form, there's room for you to list all of those supporting evidentiary materials or documents that you have included within your responses within the submission form. Really, the intention was to make this as straightforward as possible so that panelists have clear access to exactly what you want them to read about each of the specific criteria and evidence statements within the rubric and in the submission form. And I will pass it over to Nancy, who is going to talk through the other submission information.
Thank you, Matt. We'll now look at the other documents that have been posted to the RDRSSP website and that are available to you. The first is the invitation to submit. That is a 9-page document with general instructions for your submission, with all of the sections of the invitation listed for you on this slide. We'd recommend that you go ahead and review that document very carefully. The next document is the application cover sheet. Now, you might notice that on page 4 of the invitation to submit under instructions, it refers to a cover letter, but the cover letter and cover sheet are one and the same. This 7-page document is for you as applicants to provide information that is not necessarily in the rubric itself. They will, and so to that point, these items that you include on the cover sheet are not evaluated using the rubric, but it does provide the panelists with key information about how your instrument operates. It also provides space for applicants to share additional information regarding their submission that does not align to the rubric. The panel has discussed the potential, as Jessica referred to earlier, using the information from the cover sheet to provide guidance as required by Ed Code section 53008C2, which is about the appropriate administration of each screening instrument. However, it has not been determined until they have their discussions this summer precisely which parts of the cover sheet might be used for that purpose. The cover sheet has really 5 parts: logistical information about who you are, what the affiliation is in terms of the company, contact information, instrument information, is it digital, is it hard copy, perhaps it is both, etc. Administration information, how long it takes per grade, per construct. Then information about the training, tools, and supports that accompany the instrument that school districts can use to not only administer the instrument, but interpret the results, help communicate next steps to parents, make sure that the educators who are administering the instrument are fully prepared. And then finally, information about the costs of the screening instruments to school districts. Importantly, how to deliver your submission. The deadline for all information to be received is August 30th by 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. All the information on the screening instruments, the submission form, the cover sheet, etc., must be received at that time. That includes, as Matt described, any supporting evidentiary materials in addition to what you enter into the submission form. These can be delivered in hard copy or online, or electronically. We encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list. I think we had that link a little earlier, but right here, and you'll find the link on the RDRSSP webpage to keep abreast of any announcements regarding this. Digital submissions, as I indicated, could provide either or both a website accessible to panelists and staff as one or as one or more PDF documents. Those can be submitted digitally, and they would be submitted to the RDRSSP mailbox at rdrssp@cde.ca.gov. Hard copy submissions would require 15 copies of all materials mailed to the California Department of Education to our statewide literacy office at the address you see here on N Street in Sacramento. And now I will turn it back to Jess so that we can consider final questions.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So for those of you who have not yet done so, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box. As I mentioned before, there's probably going to be a lot of questions that we can't answer for a variety of reasons, but we will try to answer those that we can. And for those that we don't get to answer today, we will make sure to provide and post a FAQ document here later in the month of July to try to resolve any outstanding questions that there are. Please keep in mind that per the invitation to submit document, you can also submit your questions, as Nancy mentioned, to the RDRSSP email inbox. And if you would please submit those by August 9th, we will do our best to get answers posted before the due date of August 30th so that you have time to absorb those answers and incorporate any needed guidance into your responses. So I do see a few questions that I think we can answer. So a couple of these I'll try to answer myself, and then I will turn to some of our team members for some of the other questions. So there was a question about how many logins we need in hard copies for the submission. So per the invitation to submit, we do need 15 hard copies. For logins, it's a little bit different because it really depends on how your instrument is set up and how your logins are set up. But it should be sufficient that at least 15 people, that includes the 9 RDRSSP panel members, as well as staff that are supporting the panel, can access the screening instrument on an ongoing basis throughout the evaluation period, which will be the fall of this year. So however that needs to happen, for 15 people to be able to access it, that's how many logins are necessary. Let's see. So there was a question. Would you like all 3 components submitted separately, or can they be combined into one document? I think the answer to that question is either of those is fine. There is information in the invitation to submit document about how to submit those documents. You can do them as 3 separate, and actually, I'm not sure which of the components you're referring to. So we have the submission form, and we have the cover sheet that are required. If the third thing that you're referring to is supplementary materials that support the submission form, we would hope to see as many of those incorporated into the submission form as possible. But if you need to do a separate document, that's fine too. But those could be attachments to an email, or those could be submitted as hard copies, or both. Or you could, if you can, submit them as a single document, that's fine too. Although please keep in mind that documents of very, very, very large size can sometimes be difficult to manage. Looking at other questions. There's a question about the cover sheet. Around question 3A asks whether the instrument is digital, hard copy, or both. Is this question whether it may be administered digital or hard copy, or that the assessment itself is digital or hard copy? So there's also another question on 3B that asks about whether or not if a solution may be identified by computer or tablet, should both be selected or only one. So in this case, I would go ahead and select all that apply, and then you'll see under question 3, there's a question 3C that asks how the technology is used, and I would recommend providing information or any kind of explanation in that 3C section, where you can actually write and describe how the technology is used. And I would also write in there if there's options, as opposed to it can only be administered one way. If it's actually an option and not a requirement, I would also describe that as well, so that that's very clear to the panelists. And I'm seeing a lot of questions here that we'll likely have to respond to via FAQ. No, I see a few more coming in. I see a question regarding the 15 logins. Would you accept a single login that all panelists can use at different times or simultaneous? Yes. Yes. So again, it will depend on what makes sense for your platform. But if it's a single login and it works for 15 different folks, that's great. How public is the process of evaluation of the assessments? So the panel will hold public meetings during which it will talk about the evaluation work. The panel has not been clear yet on what the scoring will look like, so I can't really speak to that, but the process of public meetings will happen, and the evaluation of the different screening instruments that are submitted will happen publicly. It says, do you plan to release 2 rounds of Q&A responses? You just mentioned by the end of the month, and the final Q&A date is until August 9th. So yes, we anticipate that we'll be releasing a set of FAQs in the month of July to try to be as responsive as we can to as many of these questions as quickly as possible. We also understand that folks may be submitting additional questions up until August 9th. So we will also be updating the FAQs in August to help make sure that every question gets answered. And again, to make sure that you are alerted to whenever the FAQs are posted or updated, I would highly recommend joining the listserv if you haven't already. All right, I think these are all the questions that we can answer right now. If you have submitted a question that we haven't answered, please know that we are keeping track of these questions and will consider them for our FAQs. And please don't hesitate if you feel comfortable, or feel more comfortable submitting your questions again via email. We're happy to take them as well. But we are keeping track of them here. And then if anything else comes up after that you think of that you have a question about, please reach out to us via email so that we can answer your question. And again, here's the information for our email address. Again, just as I just mentioned, we'll do an FAQ posting in July, but then also one in August. We'll update at that time to reflect questions that came in by August 9th. And the best way to keep track of FAQ updates is to join our listserv. I want to thank you all for your interest and time in coming to this webinar today. We will be posting a recording of this webinar later this month. In addition, we will be posting a copy of the PowerPoint that we presented today onto our RDRSSP website a little bit later this month. We appreciate all the time you took to be with us today, and we look forward to working with you all through the rest of the process. Take care, and thank you so much.